Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special breaking news live edition of the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I am Tom Moore. No turn to Gerdeman right now. We did this on a little bit of short notice. Joined by Kevin Noon of BuckeyeHuddle.com. And Kevin, it is more recruiting news. Tony and I just did one of these shows, I think 2 nights ago, for the commitment of four-star running back James Peoples in the 2024 recruiting class. And now Ohio State has another offensive skill player added to the class, and this is a very big one. 5-star wide receiver Mylan Graham has just committed to Ohio State.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sitting here trying to get everything set up. We had this thing private at first just to make sure this was what was going down. Another huge get. Ohio State stays within the footprint of the Big Ten, goes to New Haven, Indiana. Milan Graham, fantastic receiver. I mean, let's not forget they already have Jeremiah Smith in this class. It's going to be on again. We're coming off of a class that had Carnell Tate and Brandon Ennis and Noah Rogers and Bryson Rogers. Well, now they have 2 receivers, no quarterback yet. Stay tuned. 2 receivers already in this class, and it could become just another stellar class that nobody is even going to know how to really process.
Yeah, this is just sort of what Brian Hartline does. 2 5-star players at one position group in any class is pretty noteworthy, regardless of what position group, what school it is. And with Brian Hartline, it feels like, yeah, he didn't technically, I don't think he technically did it last year. I don't think they technically had 2 5-stars, but they had 2 guys who are pretty darn close, and depending on which ranking service you wanted to go through. And, this is obviously something that he has done. He had Marvin Harrison Jr., who I don't think was technically a 5-star, but if they went back and re-ranked him, I'm going to guess he would be. And Emeka Ibuka in the same class a couple of years ago. And Julian Fleming was a 5-star the year before that. So, yeah, it is kind of just sort of what Brian Hartline does. And, this is something else that Brian Hartline does, which is get in early on someone. Because if you look at Milan Graham's offers now, it looks like, yeah, sure, they beat all the other national programs to him. But when Milan Graham got his Ohio State offer last summer, that was after he camped at Ohio State, and he had 1 or 2 kind of small offers. Ohio State was really his first big offer, and then everyone else sort of caught up. Now, sure, he's got offers from Alabama and Tennessee and Auburn and Georgia and Michigan, but this was one where Brian Hartline saw him at camp, said, yep, that is someone who I would like to add to my class, and now he's done that. And it reminds me a little bit, Kevin, of the trajectory of Jackson Smith-Njigba, where when they first offered Jackson Smith-Njigba for the 2020 recruiting class, everyone kind of went, okay, but he's much lower rated than everyone else in the class that Hartline's offering. And then by the time he actually signed, ta-da, Jackson Smith-Njigba was either a 5-star or a very, very close to 5-star, because everyone else had sort of finally figured out what Brian Hartline had figured out a little while earlier.
Yeah, and that goes to show that Ohio State does its own research, does its own, looking into these guys. I mean, it's not just a case of that Ohio State lands guys because Brian Hartline's a witch or has a spell on people or is able to do things like that. It is a case of they do their research, they know what it is that they're looking after, whether or not they find the 5-star that everybody's in after, or they determine somebody's like, this guy has got it. They've been able to do it on all fronts. So, I mean, I think the biggest thing is just being able to stack class after class after class. I mean, because, okay, it's one thing to be said about, oh, well, they landed a couple of guys along the way because, right place, right time or whatever. No, this is a case of the 22, the 22 class, even though they haven't necessarily been able to do anything yet. I mean, a lot of that has to deal with the guys who've been in front of them, but the 22 class and then the 23 class and now the 24 class. It's silly. I mean, it really is silly. I mean, we've certainly seen Ohio State do that in the defensive backfield before at times, but what are we, 11 years removed, 12 years removed from the year that Ohio State's leading receiver only had 14 receptions, a receiving group that Urban Meyer called a clown show. There is no clown show in town anymore, folks.
Yeah, it has been a very impressive run for Brian Hartline. I just went back to the 2020 recruiting class because that's kind of the oldest guys who were still on campus. Julian Fleming was the number 3 overall player in the country that year, 5-star. Jackson Smith-Njigba was a 5-star that year, number 29 overall. G. Scott, number 66 overall. Mookie Cooper, number 93 overall. Jackson Smith-Njigba, of course, off to the NFL. G. Scott off to the tight end room. Mookie Cooper off to Missouri, where he transferred. But then, obviously, you're still, Julian Fleming finally was healthy enough to start making an impact last year. And you're starting, I think they're expecting big things from him again this year. And then 2021, Emeka Egbuka, number 10 overall, 5-star wide receiver. And then you go, I'm scrolling through the list. Marvin Harrison was the number 97 player in the class, number 14 wide receiver in his class. Again, guessing they would like a do-over on that one. But Jaden Ballard, number 99 in his class, number 15 wide receiver overall. They have just kind of continually brought in those guys where you just kind of see class after class where you're seeing productivity, you're seeing a lot of talent, and there's always 3 or 4 guys there. 2022, Caleb Brown, number 79 overall. Keon Grays, number 88 overall. Caleb Burton, 132 overall. Kojo Antwi, 151 overall. And, then 2023, again, another strong wide receiver class, strong and deep. Brandon Innes, the 5-star, rated number 35 overall. Noah Rogers, rated number 53 overall. Carnell Tate, rated number 59 overall. I think we're already seeing that maybe the recruiting services might end up wanting a redo on the Carnell Tate recruiting ranking. And then Bryson Rogers, number 355 overall. And then now 2024, 2 wide receivers, 2 5-stars. This is just, Kevin, I mean, this is one of those things where you don't have to hit on everyone. All Brian Hartline does, if Brian Hartline hits on half of these guys, and the hit rate for him has been probably higher than that.
Oh, yeah.
If he just hits on half of these guys, this is a completely dominant room, and he's doing better than that. And you hear some of the other names tossed around for 2024, and boy, it sure doesn't feel like Brian Hartline's done yet again this year.
No, I mean, it's not going to be a 2-guy class. I mean, obviously, Jeremiah McClellan is somebody that I would keep an eye on out of St. Louis. How deep do they have to go this year? I don't know, but I mean, it's just been guy after guy after guy. And the thing is we've seen Chris Olave, we've seen Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson wins Offensive Rookie of the Year. Chris Olave somehow was not a finalist. I'm still not exactly sure how that ended up happening. We're going to see Jackson Smith-Njigba go probably in the top 20 of the NFL draft. Honestly, if he didn't get hurt and had, some of those things, I think we'd be talking about him as a surefire top 10 type of guy. It's just year after year. But even on top of all of that, I mean, there are still guys that were maybe not part of this super run that people are talking about now that are still getting it done in the league. And I'm not talking about going all the way back to like a Michael Thomas or somebody like that, but certainly you look at like the Terry McLaurins of the world, guys like that who were not recruited by Brian Hartline, recruited by Zach Smith, but learned under both coaches where they fell in the radar. It's impressive, and I think a lot of it too goes to the development of quarterbacks at Ohio State so far. I mean, obviously, you had Dwayne Haskins, the late Dwayne Haskins Jr. You had Justin Fields. Now you have C.J. Stroud. It's just guy after guy after guy, a very quarterback-friendly system. And while each quarterback may not exactly be, the same guy in terms of what it is that's their makeup, with these receivers, it's certainly there's a reason why a lot of these quarterbacks get labeled as first-read quarterbacks. Well, when your first read is open, why do you need to look at your fourth read?
Yeah, and they have stacked the quarterbacks, and the development of the quarterbacks is such that you just sort of assume, well, Ohio State's going to have another 5-star quarterback, and he's going to do really well, and then he's going to be a first-round pick in the NFL draft. That's just sort of the expectation at Ohio State under Ryan Day. And you go back to before Ryan Day, and that was never the expectation. Ohio State, for years and years and years, didn't produce NFL quarterbacks, or at least productive NFL quarterbacks or first-round NFL quarterbacks. And then now all of a sudden, that's just sort of the expectation, in the same way that multiple 5-star wide receivers in a class is just sort of the expectation at this point, when that's really an anomaly historically for Ohio State and for pretty much any program. The interesting, as you were talking about those different wide receivers in the past, it kind of reminded me of the way those guys talk about the culture of that room and the Zone 6 room, and learning from those guys, and the expectation that you come in and you start playing on special teams and you earn a role on special teams. And then that helps earn you a role on the offense. And that's something that just sort of gets passed down in that room as the culture of you have to earn it. And this is the way you earn it. And this is the way you go to work every day. And right now you're hearing young wide receivers talking about Marvin Harrison is out there, and he's, he is the guy who has to constantly needs the key to turn on the lights because he's the only, the first one in the building or the last one in the building at the end of the night. And the young guys learning from him. Well, Marvin Harrison, he learned from Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. And Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, well, they learned from Paris Campbell and Johnny Dixon and Terry McLaurin. And those guys learned from Austin Mack and, on and on and on, Ben Victor. And you can go back and back and back and trace that to Evan Spencer and all those guys, Michael Thomas. And that has just sort of been the culture of that room for the last 10 years or so. And when you have that kind of a culture, it feels like that's something that it becomes sort of a self-propagating thing in a way, Kevin, where if if the expectation, just the baseline expectation is, coming to practice, like whatever, that's fine, but you've got to do so much more than that. And when you're a young guy right now and you see Marvin Harrison putting in the extra work, even though Marvin Harrison is Marvin Harrison, that's just going to make you want to do it. And when by the time the guys who are young now are the old guys in the room and Jeremiah Smith and Mylan Graham are the young guys in the room, guess what? They're going to see the same expectation and the same kind of habits coming from those veterans who are going to be veterans in a year or two.
Well, yeah, I don't think anybody thought that Ohio State was suddenly going to be done with recruiting coming out of the 23 class, and that there weren't going to be guys that wanted to be the next guys in line, that weren't going to want to be the next Marvin Harrison Jr. or Emeka Egbuka or Chris Olave or Garrett Wilson or JSN, and the list keeps going on and on and on. And it's one of those things of when you start to have success, the machine is already in place. The machine is there. You know what the results are. And you just wash, rinse, repeat. I mean, it's kind of like the way that maybe Alabama is with certain defensive positions or whatever. Ohio State is certainly becoming that at wide receiver. And of course, and we're having some issues with our comments right now. So sorry that I'm not being able to punch anything through at the moment. There are going to be people will be like, yeah, well, what are they going to be able to do against Michigan with Ohio State being on the 2-game losing streak there? But the truth of the matter is that this continues to put Ohio State in the position to be that team that could win any type of game. I mean, we saw Ohio State in position to win the Peach Bowl, in position to beat Georgia, and subsequently would have gone on to play TCU in that game. I'm not here to say just because Georgia whipped up on TCU that Ohio State would have, but if Marvin Harrison does not end up getting hurt, I think we're looking at a very different set of circumstances going into this season.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The perception of the Ohio State team, if they beat Georgia, if they hang on to beat Georgia, and there are a whole bunch of different pathways. This is a lot like the 2019 season where you look at that Fiesta Bowl against Clemson, and it's like, boy, if any of 10 different plays went a different way, Ohio State wins that game. There are a bunch of them with that Georgia game as well, where if Marvin Harrison stays healthy, if they're a little more aggressive on that last drive and make that field goal a little bit shorter, there's a bunch of what ifs there. And, you change that one result, and I don't think Ohio State beats TCU by 55 or whatever it was, but 58. But, if they don't have to beat TCU by 1, and I don't think they were 56 points worse than Georgia, and probably would not have been 56 points worse than Georgia on that night. So, yeah, you're very close to a national championship, boy, that changes the perception around the program right now a little bit. But yeah, you are kind of, again, you're giving these young quarterbacks that you keep stacking. They keep stacking talented young quarterbacks, and you keep giving them talented wide receivers to throw to. And this year they've got the talented running back. They've got 4 offensive linemen already in the class, and you're looking to add a 5th and maybe a 6th there. And boy, then you're feeling pretty darn good about your offensive recruiting. And here we are, 9 months out, 8.5 months out from early signing day, and you're feeling pretty decent about recruiting. Now you just got to add the quarterback, and they may have a quarterback sometime later this week. Aaron Noland, who was the 4-star quarterback out of Georgia, he visited Ohio State last week, got the offer from Ohio State last week, felt like he sort of maybe checked the boxes they were looking for him to check. He was at Alabama on Monday, and then he's got to make a decision. He had set a decision date for April 8th, which is this upcoming Saturday. And, it feels, Kevin, like if Ohio State lands its quarterback this week, and there is certainly reason for optimism, I think we'd certainly say, in Ohio State land in terms of landing that quarterback. boy, you have the makings of a pretty darn good offensive class this year.
But Tom, what about my defensive recruiting? Where are all of the defensive recruits? The sun is shining too bright. This diamond is cloudy. I mean, everything can't be all roses. I mean, come on, man. We don't even care about the Rose Bowl. But you're right. If Aaron Nolan comes on board, that certainly gives Ohio State the quarterback. They've got the certainly the starting pieces with 4 linemen, a running back. Maybe we see something a week later with maybe another running back out of pick North, Sam Williams-Dixon, looking like he's getting close to making a decision. Everything is coming together in that offensive recruiting. I mean, they're really sitting at, this precipice of where the dam is going to break and all these recruits are going to come in. And this is all the stuff that I would like to bottle and carry this goodwill throughout the entire season. Y'all don't need to recruit here in April. Or commit here in April. Let's spread this stuff out through upcoming months, because there's certainly the necessity to have good recruiting news throughout the year.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I had to mute my computer there for a second as I was looking up some comments on our YouTube channel. As you said, they can't punch it through. So I'm going to read this super chat from Omar Austin. Thank you, Omar. Been following Kevin for 15 plus years, and you are at your best here at Buckeye Huddle. Super happy for you. That said, who is the next defensive player we get committed? Kevin, you were just talking about defense. So who is the next guy on the defensive side of the ball who you see potentially pulling the trigger, with, of course, the caveat that you can know who's coming, or have a pretty good sense for who's coming, and still the who's next question is always a little bit of an added degree of difficulty.
Exactly. And I believe Omar is hung low on the boards, been a good friend for a long time. I would still be saying Reggie Powers, the safety out of Centerville. I've had him on commit watch for a little while now, and I'm not concerned. I've not sat there and said, well, I don't think this is going to happen. It just hasn't gone through yet. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of positions that need to be addressed on defense. At corner, they had their 2 major in-state corner targets. Aaron Scott out of Springfield, Bryce West out of Cleveland Glenville were both on campus. Bryce West made it a multi-day stop. I mean, I could see some movement happening there. I mean, obviously, everybody really wants to know what's going to happen at defensive end, getting some of these rush-ins as JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer are coming potentially to the end of their Ohio State careers. And then, of course, safety, linebacker, everything else. But I really feel that it's going to be Reggie Powers. But then again, I didn't think Milan Graham was going to be making an announcement here on April 4th. I thought once he kind of made it through February that this might be something where we have to see the summer officials, and then something might happen before the start of his senior season.
Yeah, he was someone. I talked to Mark about Milan Graham a little bit on the morning show for Tuesday. So the morning show that aired slightly over 24 hours ago. And it was kind of, we knew it was going to happen, but the when is always kind of the tricky part of the question, because what's going to happen. The question is, when is it going to get announced? And sometimes that depends on when does the commitment graphic get made and all of that kind of stuff. Or is it, is it on his mom's birthday, or is it on, his birthday or something like that? So the when is kind of the tricky part of the whole process. But yeah, it was sort of, obvious that this was sort of where this was trending. And now it has happened. Milan Graham committed to Ohio State. Had a question from someone. Who the question was essentially, who is Milan Graham remind you of? Oh yeah, here it is from William McMillan. Who, if anyone, does or did what Milan Graham does on the field? And Kevin, Tony, last night we talked about Milan Graham on the Powers show, the James Powers show earlier in the week, a little bit in terms of like who might be next, and he mentioned him as like a Ted Ginn type, just incredible straight line speed, downfield receiver. He averaged 23.9 yards per reception last season in Indiana high school football, 48 receptions, 1,149 yards, 13 touchdowns, essentially a touchdown, a little more than 1 out of every 4 passes he caught. That is the kind of receiver who Ohio State has had sort of shifty receivers. Ohio State has had the possession receivers. They have not had just absolute straight line receiver like a Jamison Williams, who really turns into a productive college player at Ohio State, or what Jaden Ballard is sort of perceived to be, and maybe on the way to becoming, and maybe that's what Julian Fleming ends up being this year if he can stay healthy. But that's something that, boy, you add that to this offense, the opportunity to maybe take the top off the defense, and that makes you a much more dynamic and much more explosive offense as well.
Yeah, there's certainly been like receiver types that Ohio State hasn't necessarily been able to figure out how to answer the riddle. Certainly the real small, slight guy, the or slot guy, the Mookie Cooper type of receiver, that's not necessarily worked out as I'm being stared at by the cat. And then the straight line, the guy that's going to run the 9, that's not necessarily been something that has been part of the repertoire. But Milan Graham is, we talk about in business, too big to fail. I think he's too good to fail. I think that they're going to figure out a way to be able to make that work. I hate playing the comps game because I don't know. I think I just start hearing white noise at that point, and I don't know. But I looked at somebody else's comp, and Alan True of 24/7 has his comp as CeeDee Lamb. And if Mylan Graham ends up becoming CeeDee Lamb-esque, that certainly would not, sign me up. Sign me up.
Yeah, I think Brian Hartline would probably take that as the wide receiver coach and as the offensive coordinator, and Ryan Day would probably take that as the head coach as well. CeeDee Lamb, a fairly productive player at the college level, and I believe he's doing pretty well at the NFL level as well. Jeremiah Yoder says, good evening, gentlemen. Hope you are both well and good. Can you let us Buckeye fans know when the Ohio State spring game is? That is set for Saturday, April 15th at noon in the Horseshoe. So not this weekend, but next weekend. Saw a message from Ohio State earlier today on, through the Ohio State Buckeyes app or the email or something. And it said the early forecast for that Saturday is 80 degrees and sunny. So seems like that might be a pretty darn nice day to be out at the Ohio Stadium. And we will be there, of course, Tony and Kevin and I covering that game. And then I'm sure we're going to have a bunch of coverage around that game in the lead up to that game, in the in the wake of that game. And that's also going to be obviously a very busy recruiting week as well. Last weekend was a busy recruiting weekend for Ohio State. Kevin and I were there for the student appreciation practice. Aaron Noland was there, a quarterback who we just talked about as someone who could potentially join the class. Mylan Graham was there, someone who now has joined the class. James Peoples was there, someone who now has joined the class, as well as a bunch of other guys. So going to be a very busy time for recruiting as well. So again, Saturday, April 15th for that spring game. Bricky Loves Ohio State says, can we keep Smith committed also? That is Jeremiah Smith, the 5-star wide receiver out of South Florida. He is the number one receiver in the class. And, Kevin, I guess everyone is a little gun shy with NIL and how that has played out for Ohio State over the last year or so. But you haven't seen them lose a wide receiver yet, have you? I think it feels like Brian Hartline kind of has a lot of other stuff to sell, and they probably go in sort of knowing, okay, this is not someone who is going to make a decision solely based on NIL. And if you're not making a decision solely based on NIL, it's probably a pretty hard sell for someone else, a Florida State or a Miami or someone else down there to jump in and steal him away.
Right, exactly. I mean, Ohio State's NIL is still going to be able to get them enough to live, to wet their beak a little bit. And all you have to do is show, again, what Olave's done, what Wilson's done, where JSN gets drafted, what his guaranteed money and signing bonus, and what his, as a first round pick, more than likely, almost certainly, the 4 years contract with the 5th year, the club option. You just go through all of this. I don't know how suddenly somebody in like 6 months are they going to just sit there and get desperate and offer 4x of what they've been offering now? I think that he's already seen a lot of the best deals at this point. And then when Ohio State solidifies its class with a quarterback, be it April 8th or whenever, it's going to be fine. I just think that the biggest thing for keeping Jeremiah Smith is keeping Brian Hartline and Ryan Day. And as long as they have that tandem there, everything's going to be fine. I mean, there are going to be kids out there that NIL is everything. That is going to be, because that's probably going to be their best shot to earn at this point. But if you're a wide receiver at Ohio State and you go and you take care of your business, there's some work on Sunday for you coming up, and there's going to be a lot more money. Nobody's seen a point of where NIL has been able to outweigh what the NFL contract's going to be for a first rounder. As much as people wanted to think that NIL was going to have some huge deal to keep CJ Stroud in Columbus, and now it appears that he may be the number one pick overall in the draft, something that NIL would never be able to approach.
Right. And it's, even if you get you're not going to make, what is he going to make in NIL this year? $4 million, whatever the number is you want to throw out there. That's like, oh boy, this would be a lot of money. Well, you get the NFL contract as the number one, number two, whatever pick he ends up being. You're probably making more than that off the jump, but you're also starting that clock where the second contract where the real money is. So you start that clock, you get 1 year closer to that second contract already. That's a very, very, very hard thing for NIL to beat, and even the huge numbers that you've heard, the Nico Imaleva number or the Jaden Rashada number, those are not NFL quarterback numbers. This is, Lamar Jackson wanting $46 million or whatever it is. And you're not making that for NIL. Sorry. I don't care how good your collective is. You're not getting there.
And you could be in a system of where the offense is. I mean, you may not end up going in the first round or the fourth round or any round, because if you're in a system that is unproven or is proven to be crappy, and you don't have the quarterback and you don't have the offense that's set up there, you could have all the talent in the world. We talk all the time about players that come in with all of this ability and all this talent, and whatever happens, coaching is not able to draw it out. And it's you'd be hard pressed to see somebody at Ohio State that has been a top line guy who's earned the playing time that doesn't sit there and seem to get the talent drawn out of him in that receiver room.
Yeah, and you go, 3 consecutive picks of former Ohio State wide receivers in last year's NFL draft. In the first round, it was 11, 12, and 13, I believe, of Olave, Wilson, and Jamison Williams. And then potentially, again, Jackson Smith-Njigba this year. And, eventually that starts becoming a pattern that people notice. And you get the sense that people are maybe noticing that pattern. Fort Wayne Buckeye says, if any of the Huddle staff come over to New Haven this fall to watch one of his games, dinner is on me. We are going to be in the state of Indiana like 4 times this fall. Ohio State plays at Notre Dame, at Indiana, at Purdue, and then we'll be there for the Big Ten Media Days, July 26th and 27th. And then, potentially the Big Ten championship game as well. So could potentially spend 5 different trips to Indiana. I'm going to guess we'll probably get over to see Mylan Graham at some point while we're over there. I know Tony and Mark went to go see Caden Curry play a high school game. I think he was near Indianapolis. That was in the 2020 season, that weird 2020 season. They went to cover the protest at the Big Ten headquarters, and because the Big Ten couldn't play football, and then went on the way home and saw Caden Curry play a high school football game. And it was like, why can they play and the Big Ten can't? And the Big Ten figured it out eventually. Let's see, going through a couple more questions here. Quays Vibin says, Peyton Pierce, the linebacker, could he be on commitment watch? Kevin, he's someone who you've heard linked to James Laurinaitis from before out of Texas. He was linked to James Laurinaitis when James Laurinaitis was at Notre Dame. It certainly feels like that relationship has kind of carried over to Ohio State. I have not heard a timing thing on Peyton Pierce, but he's certainly someone who I think has a decent chance to end up in this Ohio State class.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a very strong possibility he ends up there. And, the thing is if they get into a run of commits, then, I mean, Peyton Pierce certainly could move quickly at that point. We don't know. It's not necessarily like that position that I've got, 6 guys that are vying for 3 spots right now. I mean, I know a lot of people are very interested in Sammy Brown out of the state of Georgia. I mean, Clemson's looking pretty good for him at this point. We can go through a lot of linebackers, but I think that as we're talking about who the next defensive commit is, while I would sit there and say that Reggie Powers is kind of my leader, I would probably have Peyton Pierce 2 or 3, honestly, maybe with one of the Ohio corners potentially just saying, you know what, enough with this. Let me jump on my spot while I can.
And Reggie Powers was someone who I think a week ago you would have had pretty good odds on Reggie Powers being the next guy in the class. Well, 2 guys have jumped in the class now between then and now. So maybe Reggie Powers is the next guy in the class, or is it Aaron Nolan this weekend? That's all. It is going to be a very busy week covering all of that stuff at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Couple comments about Marvin Harrison. Drowsy Dragon says Marv could be the number one pick next year and Stroud this year. Just crazy. And, Quays Vibin, I think, has the correct answer, which is Marv ain't going number one because Caleb Williams exists. And that's, I am not the world's biggest NFL person, but I can't remember the last time a wide receiver went number one. That feels like it's almost always a quarterback or maybe a tackle or an edge rusher, something like that.
Yeah.
It just feels like positionally, if Marvin Harrison, if wide receivers went number one overall, I think Marvin Harrison would probably go number one overall next year. It just feels like positionally, it's a little like running back. That's a spot that just tends to, I think he's going, top five. Someone said he was going to top five. Quays Vibe. But again, Marv going to be a top 5 pick and Mecca going to be a late first rounder. I think there's a real possibility you got a couple first round wide receivers out of Ohio State next year again, including a top 5-ish Marvin Harrison. But number one, I can't remember a wide receiver going number one in the NFL draft super recently, just because of position, not, regardless of talent.
Well, I mean, the thing is that you want to have a guy that is involved like in every play on his side of the ball. Quarterback has the ball in his hand every play that the offense is out there, even if he's handing it off to a running back. I mean, a tackle is going to be involved in every offensive play that he's out there. A defensive end is going to be involved in every defensive play he's out there. I mean, if you're a receiver, how many times are you getting targeted a game? A dozen. I mean, I think that it's a lot harder. And the thing is there's a reason why you're picking one. And that's because your team ain't no good. And you probably need a quarterback, or you need a left tackle, or you need that freak. And Marvin Harrison is a freak, but it is a position, while super important, that is not somebody that's going to have the ball going through his hands 80% of the offensive plays, 90% of the offensive plays, what have you.
Now, Kevin, how much Aaron Noland have you watched over the last few weeks or months as his name has sort of risen in the consciousness of Ohio State football? Have you watched any of his, highlights or anything beyond that?
Yeah, I actually had the chance to see him at the Under Armour camp in Atlanta with Mark. So I've seen him throw live. I've watched his highlight film 2-3 times. As things start to, whittle down a little bit, you go back and you rewatch guys just for reasons like this. When it comes up on a show, if it comes up tomorrow, I'm on 97.1 in Columbus tomorrow at 7:30 in the morning. We may or may not talk about Aaron Noland, so I better have my P's and Q's set up on that one.
Yeah, and I'm asking because Quays Vibe was asking, what have you thought about his game when you watch his tape? Like, what have you seen out of him? Obviously, seeing him in person is obviously far better than watching tape or watching a highlight reel. What were your impressions getting to see him in person?
Well, first of all, left-handed quarterbacks freak me out a little bit because it's just, you're not used to it. Everything is backwards. But, I mean, he throws a really pretty ball. I mean, was he perfect at that camp? No. But you're also dealing with, you're not throwing to camp counselors. You're throwing to other campers. And if a kid doesn't run a right route, or a kid drops a ball or whatever, it goes kind of against you because, well, why did that happen there? But, I mean, he's a guy who's like 73% in high school in terms of throwing, leads Langston Hughes to a state championship in whatever it is, 6A in Georgia. I mean, the kid's a winner. The kid has just proven that he's able to make all of the throws. And with what I saw at that Under Armour camp, no reason to dissuade me. I mean, there were a lot of good quarterbacks there, and Aaron Noland was just sitting right there. And I was like, yeah, you can go to an event and you can sit there and see 20 quarterbacks and say, I understand why this kid has 30 offers or this kid has 50 offers. And Aaron Noland is one of those kids.
And Mike Farino with a great point here with a super chat. Thank you for the super chat, Mike. With these wide receivers, makes it really hard to understand why a quarterback wouldn't want to be here, not to mention 3 straight top 15 draft picks at the position. And that's kind of the thing. Ohio State had Dylan Raiola, who is the number one quarterback in the class, committed earlier. He committed actually, I think, right after the spring game last year, and then decommitted in December. And there was kind of never a real panic after that because you just sort of assume, much like Brian Hartline is going to bring in a really good wide receiver class every year, Ryan Day and Corey Dennis and Todd Fitch are going to bring in a really good quarterback every year because why wouldn't they bring in a really good quarterback every year? To Mike's point, like, yeah, you're going to get a chance to throw to 5-star wide receivers. You're going to get the chance to get developed by Ryan Day, who is at this point one of the sport's elite, if not the best QB whisperers in the sport. And so you kind of have your pick where you lose Dylan Raiola and it's kind of next man up. And they didn't necessarily, they kind of circled back around with Jaden Davis, and Jaden Davis ended up at Michigan. But they're going to end up with someone good at that quarterback position every year, because they've had a bunch of classes recently where it's sort of dragged on real late, and you sort of get to the point where it's like, oh boy, are they going to get, are they going to be standing when the music stops and there's no chair left? And they end up in 2020, they already had Jack Miller, then they get CJ Stroud. In 2021, they got Kyle McCord pretty early. 2022, you end up with very late, you end up with Devin Brown. 2023, you end up very late with Lincoln Keenholz. And now 2024, we're talking about potentially Aaron Nolan, not a done deal yet, but again, you're just sort of stacking top 50 type quarterbacks every single year, 5 stars in a lot of cases. And that it becomes sort of a self-perpetuating cycle. Fort Wayne Buckeye says Keyshawn in 96 was probably the last wide receiver to go number 1. That sounds right. And when you can do what the Rich Kotite Jets did, why wouldn't you? Now we're going to find out if Alex Gleitman's watching. If Alex Gleitman jumps in the comments with the Rich Kotite callback. Levi says, without wide receiver recruiting, I don't know if Ohio State would be in the top 10. They need other positions to step up. And, Kevin, they certainly do. Stacking wide receiver classes is great, but you've got to, they have had classes recently where they missed on offensive line. It feels like that has not been an issue this cycle, but there are certainly positions where you got to get edge rushers in this class, and you probably need some corners in this class. And they are certainly in on guys, but this is certainly far from a done deal at this point.
Right. And the thing is too, though, is that if a guy commits early in the cycle, you kind of forget about him. I mean, nobody was talking about Jason Moore last year, and I think Jason Moore is going to be fantastic. Nobody really was talking about Caden McDonald. I think Caden McDonald's going to be fantastic. I mean, I think Jelani Thurman at tight end only came up because Auburn looked like they were going to flip him away from Ohio State, and now we're getting to see Thurman at Ohio State's events, and it's like, wow, this kid's pretty darn good. But yeah, you can't just sit there and say, well, Ohio State is this and that, and 2/3 of the equation is based on what they're recruiting at wide receiver. But I don't think it's going to be a case of where this class is going to be really unbalanced and it's going to be super offensive slammed in terms of where the points are or whatever. I think that they're in good shape with a lot of guys, whether or not it's like a Dylan Stewart or somebody like that. That's all going to be there. You sit there and you get the 2 in-state corners right off the bat. If you get Aaron Scott and you get Bryce West, that's certainly going to shore some things up. The offensive recruiting is just so far ahead of almost everybody else there nationally, though. It's going to draw more eyes, and you're just not necessarily going to be focused on where the defense is. But with that being said, if they get a class of 21 together and then they go big game hunting at the end for like 4 guys and go 0 for 4, here we go again. Ohio State in position to bring in its greatest class ever, and then everybody just kind of goes out into signing day with sad trombone in the background or whatever.
This is the time of year where everyone sort of puts their prospective class together, and it's like, well, they could end up with 15 of the top 25. And it's like, yeah, technically they're in the top 4 for 15 or the top 25 or whatever the number is. Realistically, you're not actually ever going to do that. So, this is certainly a class that is on track to be a top 5 class and potentially much more than that. But you'll sort of see how guys develop, how the class develops, and all that kind of stuff. Drowsy Dragon says Air would be our first left-handed quarterback in ages. I think in terms of starting quarterbacks, you have to go back to Steve Belisari. If Aaron Nolan does commit, he would be the first left-handed starting quarterback since Steve Belisari. I know Tony and I talked about this on a different show earlier in the week. Rick McFadden, I know, who was a backup in the kind of early 2000s. He was a lefty. I'm not remembering a lefty since then. Certainly not anyone who's played, I don't think, any kind of meaningful minutes. I was going to say,
I think maybe they had somebody kind of in the Alert 5, like third team or whatever, but it's
Yeah.
I don't see them that much here. And again, I mean, I kind of say it tongue in cheek that, how strange and alien it looks to me, but it is a little strange and alien. Do you have to bring in this day and age of analysts and everything else? Do you bring in a left-handed quarterback type of guy to sit there and work on the left-handed mechanics or whatever? I mean, that was a little conversation that Mark and I had at Ohio State scrimmage of, okay, you are a right-handed quarterback coach, you are right-handed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's all football, but it's still one of these things of where it's just a little bit different. I don't know if I'm going to be out there can coach a left-handed pitcher being, just because I'm right-handed. So, it'll be interesting to see, but it's all academic at this point until April 8th. And then it's still all academic until pen meets paper and letter of intent gets into the Woody.
Yeah, this is we are getting way ahead of ourselves here with the Aaron Nolan conversation, but that's kind of what happens here. We're trying to answer everyone's Mylan Graham's old news, Kevin. Everyone wants to know about what's next. So we're talking a little bit about what might be next. And it is always interesting that the left-handed quarterback looks so weird to everyone. And then you just mechanically you can flip the video and it looks fine as a righty. It just looks weird as a lefty. But then in baseball, everyone who talks about, the sweetest swings in baseball, and it's always lefties. It's always John Olerud. It's always Ken Griffey Jr. It's always lefties when you talk about, the really smooth, sweet swings in baseball. So a little bit opposite there. Quays Vibin says, I love asking you guys questions. Do you see Kenyatta Jackson in that too deep in the fall if he keeps showing out the way he has so far? And, you look at that too deep at defensive end, Kevin, and it's JT Tuimoloau, and it's Jack Sawyer, and it's Caden Curry. It feels like those are very solidly three. And then I think based on what I've seen so far, I'd have Kenyatta Jackson as the other guy in that two deep. What about you?
I mean, Kenyatta Jackson looked really good during the scrimmage, but let's not forget Ohio State was down. Sin Mahalski. There were a lot of times that the offense was put into nearly impossible situations, doing some 7-on-7 stuff where you're coming off of the 1 yard line, not trying to punch it in from the one. You're coming off of your own 1 yard line, and the defense was really able to just, bow back and just get after the quarterback. But yeah, Kenyatta has looked very good, and it would not surprise me if he got into the two deep. But I'll be looking forward to the post-spring game shows that we have to kind of talk about what we saw at the spring game and how we can try and extrapolate that over the next 3 months as we try to get to hotel check-in and the start of fall practice.
Oh man, hotel check-in day. Can't wait. It's almost here, practically here. The spring game is interesting because you see defensive ends, and sometimes you see defensive ends really show out there. And a couple of years ago, that was just Jack Sawyer as a true freshman. I think he had 4 sacks working against kind of a patchwork. I think it was like Zen Mahalski as a true freshman and a couple other guys. And again, you only got to get one hand on the guy. So you get anywhere close and boom, it's a sack. And, so far you have not, I don't think he has matched that production in, anywhere close to a game. I think he ended up with 4.5 sacks last year compared to 4 sacks in one spring game. And I think he led the team in sacks last year. So Drowsy Dragon says we need Sawyer to come on big this year. And it feels like they maybe have him in the spot that he should be in long-term. They've kind of moved him out of that jack position rotation, letting him focus just on defensive end. That's something that Larry Johnson obviously wants. It's something that Jim Knowles is talking like he wants, but it feels like that, that if you wanted to assume Jack Sawyer was going to have a big year this year, that is certainly something that would be something that might put him in that position.
That, and also I think the fact that a lot of the rotation, I think Larry Johnson still inherently is going to want to rotate, but there's no more Zach Harrison. On the interior line, a lot of guys have moved on to Ron Vincent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. JJB is now at Notre Dame. I think there will be more reps there for the top guys if they prove that they need to have them. Because honestly, once you kind of get past the first 3.5 guys at end, are you going to are you putting yourself in the best situation in your highest leverage games to have guys with little to no experience out there? There's one thing to be said about, I like to have guys out there that are fresh because that benefits the entire room. But you also don't want to be in a situation of where either A, you're putting your threes out there at some point during a high leverage position, or B, you're like, okay, we'll put JT Tuimoloau and somebody who has no reps, and you're not putting your best foot forward with having JT and Jack together, or however you want to sit there and do that. So a lot of things that can be kind of explored there.
Yeah, and that's something we'll obviously be keeping an eye on moving forward. There was a question from Quays Fresh about, is Caden McDonald Mike Hall 2.0? And I was just pulling up Mike Hall's recruiting profile. Right now, Mike Hall is listed at 290 pounds. Caden McDonald, he was listed at 290 as a recruit. Caden McDonald is 20 pounds heavier than him. So, is he more in the Tyleik Williams 2.0 kind of role? I don't know if
Caden McDonald is somebody that they haven't had for a while.
Yeah,
A true one tech. This is something that is much more SEC football or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Ohio State has had like a big three and a smaller three or whatever, but it's not been a case of them having a true one, maybe even a zero, and right over the center type of guy like McDonald. McDonald is one of these guys that, if he has success at Ohio State, does that open up Ohio State in terms of being able to land some other guys like this? Because it's just so different than what we've seen out of Ohio State through the years. I have a hard time remembering somebody and saying that guy truly was a one and not just a big three.
Yeah, and if you have a true like zero, then you're looking at, can you run a 3-man front? And that sounds like something that is not going to happen at any point when Larry Johnson is at Ohio State. So it's probably a little bit more of an academic conversation, but that's something that could happen at some point in the future. Question from Christian Person: how many wide receivers are getting drafted next year other than Marvin Harrison Jr. from Ohio State? Emeka Ibuka, I think someone earlier talked about him as a late first rounder. I think he's in that first round conversation. Julian Fleming certainly has the measurables, has the explosiveness. It's just a matter of, can Julian Fleming stay healthy? If Julian Fleming has a good, healthy season, I think you can see all three of those guys get drafted in the first 2 to 3 rounds, I think. And then you also have Jaden Ballard. Jaden Ballard is someone who you really haven't seen do a whole heck of a lot on the field, just because there have been talented guys ahead of him. But the measurables are there. The speed is there. If he turns in a big season this year, he's another guy who could potentially get drafted out of that wide receiver room next year. And if you lose 3 to 4 of those guys, oh boy, Carnell Tate's probably your number 1 wide receiver next year. And it is a very different look in that wide receiver room. But this is why it is very important for Brian Hartline to keep stacking that talent, because it feels like a lot of these guys just got here. JT Tuimoloau, Emeka Ibuka, Jack Sawyer, Mike Hall, Tyleik Williams, like these guys just got here, and we're talking about this as potentially their last year at Ohio State. If they have a big year this fall, you could be turning over essentially the entire defensive line, the entire wide receiver unit. You could be turning over the quarterback position if it's Kyle McCord and he has a good year and turns pro. So that's potentially a lot of NFL draft picks on the horizon for Ohio State. And replacing all those guys would be a problem, but this is one of these good news, bad news situations, Kevin, where if you have 4 wide receivers who are NFL draft eligible and go after one season, and you have 4 defensive linemen who are NFL draft eligible and go after one season, if you're having good enough seasons to do that, well, that's probably a pretty good indication on how the 2023 season went as well.
When I was at the NFL scouting combine earlier this year, I was talking with some other writers, and we were trying to go up with what a realistic number is of players that could be invited to the combine from Ohio State. And I think we got up to like 17 or 18. I mean, next year really could be one of those types of years for Ohio State. And I mean, when you sit there and you're like, wow, 10, that's leads the nation this year or whatever, 11, 12. I mean, I'm having a hard time keeping it much under 15 at this point. And there are always going to be guys that don't get invited for whatever reason. I mean, it's generally not going to be your 1s, 2s, and 3s, but it just kind of happens. But, you talk about the receiver position and you just never know. Who would have thought that Noah Brown would still be in the league? I mean, he just signed a new deal with Houston after a long career with Dallas. You just never know. So, obviously Marvin, obviously Emeka. I mean, Julian is somebody that thinking you a lot of times it's a later picture drafting on potential, and Julian certainly has the measurables and certainly has a lot of things going on there. And I don't think Ohio State, outside of one or two games, ever really got to the full potential of Noah Brown. And that may end up being the legacy that Julian Fleming leaves. But he could still go on and have a productive NFL career. It only takes one team to take you.
Got a couple more in the comments. Michael Campbell says, and I can't tell who he's a fan of. He says Ohio State has 120. Another wide receiver. Ohio State has 125 receivers and can't kick a field goal for a championship. The offensive line is going to be wet toilet paper and can't beat Michigan. 7 versus 7. You crying, laughing emoji, shamrock emoji. So I can't tell if Michael Campbell's a Notre Dame fan or not. Which, if you are 90 years old, you may have seen Notre Dame beat Ohio State in your lifetime. If not, ask your great grandfather.
The fact that I looked bored there is because when I heard it was Michael Campbell talking trash, I just stopped listening.
Christian Person says we're crystal ball for the number 1 edge. If we keep recruiting him well, we might be able to get him. Is that Dylan Stewart? I don't see. I was just pulling up the crystal balls or the 247 composite top defensive ends. I don't see Ohio State crystal ball for anyone. I'm guessing he's talking about Dylan Stewart, the edge out of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and that's who I think he's talking about.
Larry Johnson has had some pretty darn good success recruiting the DMV over the years. So definitely someone to keep an eye on there. And that is a position of need for Ohio State. They also just had the number 8 defensive end, Marquise Lightfoot, in town last week. He's out of Chicago. Yeah, so he was in town last week. So he's someone to keep an eye on in terms of that edge position as well. Let's see, going through everything. Michael Campbell does hit that like button. Strong agree.
I was going to say, there are times I want to sit there and launch Michael Campbell into the center of the sun, and then but he seems to be a good dude. It blows my mind sometimes, and I treat him pretty rough, but I do respect the passion, just not the questions.
And he says, bring your loss to Marshall and Stanford Science in Notre Dame Stadium. Marcus Freeman is building his revenge tour. And yeah, I mean, the first year for a first-time head coach is always a little bit questionable. How you got a lot to learn. That's a tough adjustment and all that kind of stuff. I don't know that he was necessarily 100% ready last year, but that will definitely be a game that is a much watched game. Going to be one of the most watched games of the season. I'm already looking forward to that trip to Notre Dame in late September next year. We already have our hotels booked. Should be a fun trip. Have you seen a game at Notre Dame Stadium, Kevin?
I have not. I've been on the Notre Dame campus. I was there to cover a camp, and I drove through there once on my way back from Chicago just to change it up, but I've never seen a game there. It is certainly on my bucket list.
Yeah, I saw one, like 15 years ago. It was one of the Charlie Weiss teams that finished with a losing record, and they played Michigan State and they lost, and it was probably like 2006 or 2007, something like that. Very cool place to see a game. Just one of those, you're a college football fan. You need to go see a game there at some point. Just, it's like you're a baseball fan. You got to go see a game at Wrigley and a game at Fenway and that kind of stuff. You got to go see a game at Notre Dame. You got to go see a game at Ohio State. You got to go see a game at Michigan. You got to go see a game in the Rose Bowl. Like, this is one of those, you got to tick it off your list. So if you have not gone to see a game there, that is definitely worth a trip. That is an easy drive from Columbus as well. Quays Vivan says, I'm the question guy today. Anything on Hero Canoe? Can he be that zero that you were talking about?
Hero's still learning the game at this point. I mean, he's a big guy, don't get me wrong, but he's not a zero. He's not a one in my book in terms of just, how broad he is and everything else. I mean, he is a big three to me, but he's still learning football. Remember, he's from a small town in Germany. Brandon Collier with the PPI, the Pro Prospects International Group. He did this tour. Hero's video came out playing at Rancho Santa Margarita Catholic in California. Just, a kid that doesn't know how good he is, freakishly good. Now he's at Ohio State surrounded by guys as good and better, and he's still trying to put it all together, but he's always all smiles, and I think it's going to come together, but I don't see him as that really broad guy. That just doesn't seem to be where his frame is.
All right. Bricky Loves Ohio State says the question is, will Knowles give these younger guys the playing time they need to develop and gain experience? I'd love to see our staff do a better job of getting these backups in to gain some experience sooner. And that's one of those things that's a great idea until the backup gives up a 70-yard touchdown. I'm going to say the name Cam Martinez, and reflexively, every half of the audience is going to say, "Why did they put him in against Michigan? He only played 4 snaps and he gave up one long touchdown." There you go. So, they're going to play these guys situationally to get them ready. They obviously know they need game reps. They understand the importance of game reps, and that's what the Youngstown State game is for. That's what the Western Kentucky game is for. That's what the Rutgers game is for. You have games on your schedule where you're going to get these guys a lot of reps. And, I think everyone is going to look better this year because it is the second year. We talked to a bunch of guys last week in the secondary, and they all talked about how this was the first time they had been in the same system 2 years in a row at Ohio State. It had constantly changed, where it was either a different defensive coordinator, or it was a different system, or it was just kind of constant change. And now you finally got a little bit of continuity. That in and of itself is probably going to help. That in and of itself is going to help guys be prepared more for next season. And that in and of itself is a strong reason why you can't take one bad game and say, you got to fire the defensive coordinator and start over. You got to have a little bit of patience. This is where that patience kind of comes on and is valuable and pays off long term. Michael Campbell says Notre Dame, the most iconic campus in college football. It is certainly up there. There aren't that many places where, touchdown Jesus. If I say touchdown Jesus, everyone knows what that is, where that is, can picture that in their mind. It is definitely a campus that is worth visiting. I remember there was like a Knights of Columbus steak sandwich stand, and it was just like one of those random things kind of on their version of the oval, like on the quad or whatever it is called at Notre Dame. I had a really good steak sandwich at Notre Dame, and this is like 15 years ago. So it is again, definitely worth the trip. It's one of those things where it's a little like Wrigley, where they've modernized it a little more than I probably would have liked, but that's just kind of how it goes. So it's not the old iconic Notre Dame stadium quite like it used to be, but it is still one of those places you need to go see a game. Drowsy Dragon says, when will Day name the starting quarterback? And yeah, I mean, Kevin, if I set the over under as May 1st in terms of when Ryan Day will name the starting quarterback, are you betting the over or the under on May 1st?
Over. I know he can sit there and say all he wants that he would like to name a quarterback coming out of the spring. That's all well and good if it ends up being Kyle McCord, which it very well may. But if you name Devin Brown, and then you basically give Kyle McCord all summer to enter the portal and leave, and then your two is who? Tristan Gebbia, Lincoln Keenholz, probably Gebbia because he has experience and he was here for spring, whereas Keenholz is still in South Dakota going through. He went through basketball. I think he won a state championship up there in basketball, et cetera, et cetera. There's just not really a huge ton of upside in naming it, in my opinion. I don't know why you necessarily need to rush to do it. And when Ryan said something going into the spring about hoping to have it at that point, I'm like, well, he makes a lot more money than I do, so obviously he has a plan there, but I don't see it.
Yeah, it feels like there's no real rush to do it. There's always a question of, oh, do you need your team leader before a certain point or whatever? And I don't really buy that. It feels like one of those things where, like, yeah, I'm sure they would love to know who the starting quarterback is. Are they going to, at the end of spring practice, are they going to announce who the starting quarterback is at the end of spring practice? I would, never say never. I would be fairly surprised if they did. There's a question about, who is Ohio State in terms of defensive tackles this year? This is one of these shows where it'd be great to have Alex or Mark on. I'm sort of scrolling through the defensive tackle list right now and not seeing anyone who is, on any kind of imminent commitment watch, certainly for Ohio State. There are names that you will know as you go through there, but I don't feel like I would have a super high degree of confidence in any individual defensive tackle signing with Ohio State in 2024. Do you have anyone that just immediately jumps out to you?
I'm looking right now because I'm barely holding this show together with my computer. I don't want to take any bandwidth away by doing a search. So let me get back. I mean, I was going through doing some graphics today, and I think I did build one just for the hell of it for a D tackle. I thought that could potentially be coming at some point, but for the life of me, cannot think of it. But give me a second.
Well, Nigel Smith has been to Ohio State at least once or twice, I know, out of Texas. His crystal ball is currently 100% to Oklahoma, but he's someone who you've seen at Ohio State.
Those two crystal balls are probably from the two Oklahoma insiders who pick everybody to Oklahoma. And I don't mean to be ugly about it, but it's kind of, I think anybody who follows those things will sit there and say, yeah, that's just kind of how that is. Justin Scott, the D tackle out of Chicago, is somebody potentially. Remember, Ohio State put together a very solid D tackle class last year, so that doesn't mean that they can ignore the position this year, but they are not as short at that position as maybe they are in a lot of other years.
And looking through, Quiz Vibin says, do you agree if Julian Fleming gives us between 35 to 40 catches, 600 to 800 yards, 7 to 11 touchdowns, with him being a freak athlete, can he sneak in the first round? Because we know the NFL loves freak athletes. He feels like someone where if he puts up those kind of numbers and stays consistently healthy for the year, sure, I think you can have that conversation. I think that's just, does an NFL team feel comfortable enough in his consistency, in him be able to put together a strong, healthy season? That might be enough with all the other measurables to get him in that conversation. But
what happens at the combine when they go in and they medically probe and prod him and everything else and look at his shoulder and everything else? I mean, I think a lot of that plays a factor as well. And we've seen guys that we think are going to go in one spot, slide 20 spots, slide 40 spots because of things that we don't necessarily know about in the public because of what comes out of some of these medical tests.
Yeah. And Michael Campbell says, thank you again for Javonte Jean-Baptiste. He's on a revenge tour too. The Ohio State defensive end who was a backup at Ohio State for years and transferred to Notre Dame during this offseason. If Javonte Jean-Baptiste turns into a productive defensive end for Notre Dame, I mean, good for Notre Dame. He was someone who played at Ohio State, nice, solid player, was never really, he kind of just played and was never super, super productive for Ohio State. So, if he turns into a productive player for Notre Dame, very, good. That's
more,
great.
More power to him. Yeah.
And spring is, we talked about this with Jack Sawyer earlier. Spring is not the time to really make a real hard and fast determination on how good a defensive end is going to be, because you're playing with quarterbacks you can't tackle. And, so the stack numbers and the dominance looks maybe more impressive in the spring than it will necessarily in the fall.
The old Bam Childress Award.
That's not specific to Javonte either. That's specific to
I'm just saying though,
people
people fall in love with somebody over the spring and think that everything is going to turn around, and spring is spring, and you have to. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to translate or whatever. It was kind of like at the first scrimmage, Gabe Powers made play after play after play, but he's kind of wedged in right now with Tommy and Steele and Cody ahead of him and whatever else kind of comes out of that room. And I'm still not convinced that, Gabe is necessarily at his final position, but, we'll see. As back to Michael's point, if JJB can give Notre Dame some good reps and everything else, I'll be happy. I always really like talking to Javonte. I mean, I didn't get to talk to him much, but he's a good kid, and you'd like to have him have success every game, maybe but one. But I don't think that he's going to come out and suddenly be, start getting the press clippings of an Isaiah Foskey.
Yeah, he's someone who was a real nice kid. I remember talking to him immediately after his true freshman season when he was talking about how all the stuff he had to do to try and put on weight to get to defensive end sized at Ohio State, because he came in very, very undersized and was just eating like 8,000 calories a day and just waking up in the middle of the night and eating food and all that kind of stuff. And he also was he's a great follow on Instagram and other social media, because he would go around and do questions, like just ask random teammates, who on the team would you not want your sister to date? And it was always great content, like a great personality. I really like Javonte. And yeah, definitely, hopefully he puts it all together this fall for Notre Dame. I was going to just wrap up and quiz Vibe in with a great question. Do you agree that losing Luke Whippler is the biggest blow to this team, with him leaving because he really could help the quarterback out there in the field? I don't know that that's the biggest blow. I think that was maybe the most surprising NFL draft declaration. And, we'll see how Carson Hinsman does at the center position, or if it ends up being Vic Cutler, or if when Jacob James comes back, how he does. This is one of these, to me, Kevin, like the Magic 8-Ball, answer foggy, ask again later, because the pain of losing someone depends largely on the quality of the replacement, and we're still 9 practices into the spring at this point, so I don't know how much we really can tell you about the quality of the replacement just yet.
I would be much more concerned if Ohio State was replacing both of its guards rather than replacing both of its tackles. If Donovan Jackson and Matt Jones weren't going to be on the other side and you were going to have 3 new interior offensive linemen, I think that would have been very much a gigantic concern. I mean, obviously your tackles still a big concern, and maybe still a bigger concern about what right tackle is going to look like than what's going to happen at center. And again, we don't know if Carson Hinsman's going to be able to hold everybody off and keep that position, or as you said, Vic Cutler, Jacob James. I mean, there certainly are going to be some names out there. We haven't even necessarily been in a case where we've been able to see a ton of snaps. I mean, we see a lot of plays being run at scrimmages, but that's still very kind of a little bit of a different speed than going against a team that's wearing a different color uniform and everything else. So, we'll see. And I mean, I'm very impressed with where I've seen Whippler on a lot of draft boards. He made a smart decision, I think, because not a really good center draft. And I think that he's going to probably be able to secure a little bit of a higher spot just based on the fact of, it's him. It's that John Michael Schmitz out of Minnesota. I think Whippler's like number 3 on a lot of the center boards.
All right. And the questions keep coming. We're going to wrap it up on this one for Mecca Hanna. How is Caleb Burton doing? Caleb Burton has been banged up this spring, so we're missing. We have not seen a lot of Caleb Burton, but that's just been because Caleb Burton has been banged up and has not really been going as much. I mean, right? Have you seen any of Caleb Burton? I don't feel like we've seen much of him this spring.
No, and I have to, since I went round and round to learn, it's Mika, not Mecca. Mika Hanna.
Oh, Mika. Sorry.
Yes, I want to make sure, but he'll thank me in the comments. No, I haven't had a chance to see a lot of him, but I'm also going to say that my eyes keep getting drawn to Carnell Tate and to Bryson Rogers and to Noah Rogers, and we're still not even talking about Brandon Ennis yet. I mean, it is going to be a very tough battle to get reps in there, especially when you look at the guys at the top and you have a couple guys who are not going in the spring. Obviously, you have Marvin Harrison Jr., who would probably take every rep if given the opportunity. But when it comes to that next wave of who are going to be the next guys, nothing is going to be given.
Yeah, that is a very, very, very competitive room right now. It is only going to be a more competitive room this time next year when Jeremiah Smith and Mylan Graham, a pair of 5-star wide receivers now committed to Ohio State, potentially join that room.
Ah, you brought it full circle.
Hey, there you go. Some of us have done this before, Kevin. True professionals. I started this thinking, 20 minutes, tight, in and out, bing, bang, boom. And here we are, an hour and 8 minutes later. But that we can only thank you guys for that. We appreciate all your comments, all your questions. This is, as we always say, we are here for you guys. We are not here to hear ourselves talk. So answering your questions, we haven't done a live show in a little while. So good to see some familiar names there in the questions. Good to see some new names there in the questions. We appreciate all of your questions, all of your comments, all of your thumbs up, all of your subscriptions on our podcast feeds, all of your memberships at BuckeyeHuddle.com. We appreciate all of it. So thank you all for being a part of this. Again, Milan Graham, 5-star wide receiver out of Indiana, the second 5-star receiver to commit to Ohio State's 2024 recruiting class. We will be back. I'm sure we're back at the Woody Hayes on Wednesday talking to tight ends and running backs. We will, I'm sure, have another Buckeye Weekly show, I would guess, coming out of that one. We'll probably have another Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning show coming out of that one as well. So plenty of stuff coming this week on our podcast feeds. Just wherever you get podcasts, just search Buckeye Huddle. You will find all of our great shows, the Big Me Kickoff, Buckeye Weekly, Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning, all there. Just search Buckeye Huddle to find all of those. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to our channel, hit that bell so you get notified when we do live stuff like this, because sometimes stuff kind of springs up on us, and we only have a little bit of a short notice on it, so don't get to give you a real big heads up. So make sure you are subscribed to our channel. Make sure you are click that bell to get notified when we do live shows, all at youtube.com/Buckeye Huddle. And of course, at the mothership, BuckeyeHuddle.com. Fantastic coverage of the team, fantastic coverage of recruiting, fantastic coverage of X's and O's, fantastic community on the huddle board there as well. So sign up today at BuckeyeHuddle.com. That will do it, guys. Thank you all for joining us. We'll talk to you later.